A Czech scholar working for the Bulgarians raided both monasteries and stole something of the order of about 700 to 800 plus manuscripts.
Hey YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. So today I have Hefin Jones with us today, and we're going to talk about the kind of cutthroat and skullduggery that's often found when it comes to manuscripts and how people acquire them. More specifically, a number of manuscripts have been stolen. and Hefin, you've tracked down a couple of those. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what's going on here?
I'm not an expert on the theft of manuscripts that have happened over the ages. There have been quite a few cases in different times, different places. Accusations made about even well-known names in textual criticism have been accused from time to time of stealing things from various places. But recently, I've become interested in a particularly well-known incident which happened back during World War One. There was a monastery in northern Greece called Kozinica. There's another monastery nearby in a place called Ceres. I'm not sure if I got the pronunciation quite right of either of those places. I don't do modern Greek, but Kozinica and Ceres monasteries. And in 1917, a Czech scholar, he was a scholar, but working for the Bulgarians, raided both monasteries and stole something of the order of about 700 to 800 plus manuscripts, of which probably roughly coming around about 80 to 100 of them are New Testament manuscripts. Manuscripts which would normally have GA numbers, Gregory Allen numbers. So this probably constitutes one of the bigger manuscript thefts
Oh, wow.
that has ever happened. I've become interested in recently because I'm originally from Australia. I currently live in the Philippines, but Australia does not have a lot of New Testament manuscripts. I think there are some total of 4 New Testament manuscripts with GA numbers in Australia. And one of them is allegedly from Bulgaria. But the more people have looked at it, the more people think, now this is one of these stolen manuscripts that got stolen from northern Greece during World War One, and somehow
Mm,
or other it ended up turning up in the library at Sydney University. And I've been looking at that manuscript in the last month or so, and that's how I've got interested in this whole story. I guess one extra thing to throw into this is that some people with good memories might remember that the Museum of the Bible had a similar issue
mm.
back in around about 2020. And they have found a manuscript there. It's called GA 1424. I think that's the right number, 1424. Or E 2020 is, oh no, E 220 is the other number for it. And it turned out to be a manuscript that had been taken from this same monastery, Kozinica in northern Greece. And the Museum of the Bible, when they realized where it had come from, they actually ended up speaking with the authorities of the Greek Orthodox Church and with the leadership of the church there in northern Greece, and ended up actually returning the manuscript
Okay.
over 100 years, maybe 103 years after it had been taken. They returned it to Kozinica. So this is kind of, I'm interested in what's
Interesting.
probably the great manuscript heist,
That's
probably
right.
the largest theft, as far as I'm aware, probably the largest single theft of New Testament manuscripts and other manuscripts that I am aware of.
That's really interesting. So, just to I don't want to sideline the conversation too long here, but there was a really a super Canadian heist that happened a number of years ago, and this had to do with a number of Quebec dealers in maple syrup. And these guys had
Yeah.
apparently stolen tens of millions of dollars worth of maple syrup and ended up getting away with it for some time before they were caught. But yeah, just interesting how certain things, right? Certain things just get stolen with value. Now, you said they raided. Sorry, what was the name of the scholar?
Oh, okay. I haven't mentioned him. So
Oh,
he's
okay.
not. So his name is Vladimir, something like Vladimir Sis. So he was actually he was born in the old Austrian-Hungarian Empire. We're talking about the time before the First World War. So
Hmm.
Czechoslovakia the Czech Republic, which as people now know it, was not actually independent. It was part of the
Right.
Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he was ethnically a Czech, and he was a Slavophile. That means he loved everything to do with Slavic languages and
Right, right.
Slavic peoples. And so he was a big fan of the Serbs and of the
Okay.
Romanians, not the Romanians, the Bulgarians and all kinds of other peoples. And he ended up getting involved in some of the conflicts that were happening in the Balkans back around about the time. The Balkans basically had been ruled by the Austro-Hungarians for a long time and also by the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, for a long time. And that was all falling apart at the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century.
Right.
And he got involved. But he had been well educated, well trained, and at some point had picked up a smattering of real scholarship in Greek manuscripts and other manuscripts. He had converted to Eastern Orthodoxy at some point, to Greek Orthodoxy at some point, and he spent some time as a monk on Mount Athos. But then he'd gone to become a war journalist, a bit of an
Oh,
ethnographer,
interesting.
and all kinds of things. And he ended up basically really falling in love with Bulgaria in particular. And yeah, during the First World War, took opportunity to increase the Bulgarian holdings of New Testament manuscripts. Now I've said that this is the great manuscript heist I've described as a theft or looting. Now, it does depend who you talk to as how you should
Right.
describe this. Now, I mean,
Right, right.
in neutral terms, you could describe it as the transfer of 700 manuscripts from two monasteries, from those monasteries in northern Greece to
Right.
Sofia in Bulgaria. If you're Bulgarian, some people have claimed that this was an attempt to protect them during a time of war, to make sure
Right.
they got conserved and didn't get destroyed. So that claim has been made. Of course, if you're Greek, then you tend to characterize this as being a straightforward looting. Unfortunately, Bulgaria came out, well, not unfortunately, however you look at it, Bulgaria came out of the First World War on the losers' side and were
Right.
actually told, as part of the end of the First World War, you have to return these manuscripts and all these other things that you've stolen from these monasteries and return them to Greece, which they did partially. They returned
Right.
about 200, 250 of these manuscripts, so about one third of them returned them from Bulgaria to Greece, but kept around 400, 500 of them in Bulgaria
Right.
under custody of this guy, Vladimir Sis. And he wasn't just a kind of a warlord. Some people have actually called him that, a warlord. He wasn't just a kind of an opportunist. He knew his Greek, he knew his Latin, he knew allegedly up to 16 languages.
Oh, wow.
He cataloged all these manuscripts very carefully. He made a big catalog of them. He kind of organized them. He could actually do a good job of dating them and just describing them. So
Interesting.
people have looked at his work afterwards and said, "Oh, yeah, he was a serious scholar. He did a pretty good
Interesting.
job of describing what he'd collected." But yeah, it was the means by which he'd appropriated them on behalf of the
Right.
Bulgarian government and authorities. That was the questionable part.
That's interesting. And just for my viewers, right? To understand the real gravity of the situation, right? This is pre-internet, pre like, free flowing data, right? So to get your hands on a number of manuscripts. I mean, this wasn't just New Testament manuscripts. This was a number of written works. What
Oh,
other
well,
works were included in the heist?
Oh, well, there was a bunch of Old Testament, Septuagint manuscripts as well. I think in terms of proportion, there were probably slightly more New Testament things than there were Old Testament. There were lots of patristic writings, Chrysostom's commentaries and sermons.
Mm,
There were lots of service books, the kinds of things you'd expect to have in a Greek Orthodox monastery, service books for the various different services of the church. There'd be devotional literature which the monks might be reading in their spare time. There was very little classical literature. There were one or two examples of classical literature, and they're among the bits that went most walkabout and didn't end up staying even in Bulgaria, but ended up appearing reappearing unexpectedly in the 1990s or maybe in the early 2000s in Prague. I estimate of the 750, 800 manuscripts, probably about 100 of them should have had. They didn't necessarily all have, but should have had what Gregory Allen numbers, which are the registration numbers that we use for New Testament manuscripts. So that's a
Right.
good percentage of them.
Now, you think there's any New Testament manuscripts in there that are not cataloged?
Well, there certainly were manuscripts from Kozinitsa and Serres, which, though both places had
Hmm.
been studied by various people, well-known people, so even Scrivener's plain introduction talks about both those
Hmm. Okay.
monasteries, books by people like Kersop Lake and people like Gregory himself actually catalog
Hmm.
some of the material. Uh,
Hmm.
we know that their catalogs were not complete, that they missed stuff, and there was more stuff in those monasteries than the extant catalogs that existed in the early 20th century. There was more stuff in there than was cataloged. Yeah, yeah.
Right. That's incredible. So now, how did he manage to like I'm picturing in my mind like a bunch of SWAT vehicles pulling up to the monastery and a bunch of guys coming out with like, modern armor and automatic weapons and just like hand over the
I
manuscripts. How did he do it? Like how did he
So what?
convince them?
So okay. Well, the convincing did involve guns and force,
Uh-huh.
definitely. So he turned up with a force of about 50 or 60 Bulgarian soldiers. Now, whether they
Oh
were
wow.
regular soldiers or partisan, different people say they were different things. I've heard from some sources that apparently they were all wearing Turkish army uniforms, so they did a bit of plausible deniability. They appeared as like Turkish military rather than, because the Turks and the Bulgarians and the Greeks, they were all kind of in this bit of a mess at the time in this part of northern Greece. And so they made it look plausibly deniable that it was them. But it was fairly well planned. He'd spied out the land maybe a year in advance, and he had a good idea of what was in both monasteries. And he brought a force of about 50 men with him both times. In fact, he did one monastery around about March 1917, and he did the other monastery, which wasn't very far away, about 3 months later, about June or July of 1917, and then took them off to Sofia in Bulgaria. I think they had something like dozens of pack animals, so they had mules or whatever, brought them along. So they
Okay.
were it was a bit of a special operation, 1917 style,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
not Kevlar and machine guns, but certainly they were. It was a military operation. Yes.
That's interesting. I couldn't imagine like being one of the guys in the monastery is just like looking out and seeing this force of guys coming toward you for your
Yeah.
goods, right? But
Yeah.
this isn't really like this kind of skullduggery isn't like this isn't the only example of this. And I think it was
Yeah.
Vaticanus was
Yeah.
kind of moved around under certain auspiciouses, right? Like the
So yeah,
yeah.
so amongst the famous examples, certainly libraries have been stolen by various people. So for instance, there was a very famous Protestant library at the University of Heidelberg. I think it's Heidelberg. I was at Tübingen. One of the two got basically stolen during the sort of post-Reformation period, and is now in the Vatican Library. If you want a really good Protestant library from the kind of Reformation period, they've got a really good collection at the Vatican because they pinched it
That's interesting.
during that period. And also the Vatican Library, Napoleon conquered Italy. Can't remember the exact year, but soon after, around about 1800, in the early 1800s, Napoleon conquered Italy, and he actually took Codex Vaticanus and a whole bunch of other stuff from the Vatican and took it to Paris. And it was in Paris for quite a while. In fact, it was in Paris long enough for it to get studied in Paris
Oh,
by
okay. Okay.
some of the early textual critics. So I think Hug, who was a German Catholic, he got to study Vaticanus while Vaticanus was still in Paris. And even more recently, if you look at the images, you've been showing some images of Vaticanus recently. Even the
Yeah.
images of Vaticanus are available online. You occasionally find stamps. Now, some of the stamps on the
Yeah.
pages are clearly the stamps of the Vatican Library, but there's the occasional whatever, I can't pronounce French, but it's the National Library of France stamp can be seen on a couple of
Oh,
pages of
yeah, yeah.
because
You're right.
that's from the period when Vaticanus was in Paris. And apparently, when the Waterloo, what's his name, good old the British general kind of defeated Napoleon. The Brits actually at one point thought of that they'd claim Vaticanus for themselves, and so you had that crazy situation where both Vaticanus and Sinaiticus might have ended up at the British Museum. But as it turned out, in the end, they decided to give it back to the Pope that he should have his manuscript back. So
And
yeah, it's certainly happened before. Codex Gigas, whatever it's called.
okay, yeah, Gigas, yeah. The
Yeah,
big devil.
the famous one with the huge
Yeah,
picture of
yeah,
the
yeah.
devil in it. It's in Sweden, and that's because the Swedes were a rampaging bunch of raiders, not just under the Vikings, but also
Interesting.
during the Protestant Catholic Wars in the 16th and 17th century. They used to go raiding around Germany and that area, and they went to Prague and they raided the Czechs or the Bohemians as they were back then, and they stole Codex Gigas from Prague in 16, whatever it was. I don't know. This kind of thing happens.
Yeah, I think Sinaiticus is another one, isn't it? Wasn't it like taken from the monastery and then given to the Russian Tsar for a
Uh,
little bit and
I'm gonna be very cautious about saying what happened with Sinaiticus.
okay, okay.
There is an official statement from all of the parties as they exist today. So that's the monks of St. Catherine's, the Russian authorities, the guys in Leipzig, and the British Museum. They've all got like an agreed statement as to what they think kind of happened. It's
Okay.
just complicated. It was so certainly one could argue that Tischendorf, the first 40 or so folios that he took, the conditions under which he took them are a little bit murky, to say the least.
Right.
And there were arguments afterwards about how the rest of the manuscript was taken, whether it was a loan, whether it was sold, or whether what kind of was it a gift, but there was some sort of other transactions going on in the background. Yeah, these things happen with manuscripts, or have happened during the past,
Right,
definitely.
right. And we would be remiss to not talk about, right, first century Mark. And actually there was even some controversy surrounding the mummy masks. I had a book here from Joshua McDowell, and
Yeah.
it's called
Oh,
God Breathed. And in it he was talking about how they would take these mummy masks and they would,
yeah. Yeah.
wash them in soap.
Yeah.
And then there would be these New Testament
Yeah.
manuscripts, and of course a
Yeah.
bunch of people got upset because now you're destroying these artifacts, and nobody knows where they got them from. The whole green collection thing was a very big deal.
Yeah.
So like, and this is like early 2000s. This is
Yeah.
like really
Oh,
recent. So
it had been going on for a very long time. So a lot of New Testament manuscript fragments, a lot of them come from Oxyrhynchus. Grenville and Hunt dug them up in around about 1900. Just before
mhm.
and just after 1900, they did their big expedition there. They found all this stuff in the rubbish dumps, and so you get all this sort of all these memes and all this sort of talk
Yeah,
about
yeah,
how
yeah,
modern critical text has been taken out of the
yeah, yeah,
rubbish
yeah,
dump,
yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And some of their texts were probably what they call cartonnage. They were basically packing, like you had to pack a mummy into its coffin and make sure it doesn't move around too much. One of the things you could do is make papier-mâché out of
Hmm.
papyrus, like
Yeah,
papyrus papier-mâché, and kind of form it into a nice shape, fit your body inside the sarcophagus, or however you say that word. I don't know how to
yeah,
say that
yeah.
word. And then it'd be there. And people discovered around about probably a bit before Grenfell and Hunt that actually, if you actually wet this material, it actually would come apart, and you could actually reconstruct and find,
Oh,
significant
interesting.
text. And that's been going on so since the late 19th century up until recently. And yes, without naming naming any names, yes, there was one guy in particular associated with the Green Collection and what's become the Museum of the Bible, who was quite infamous for going around with a couple of mummy masks and actually showing people how to do this in kind of apologetic situations. And then he would presumably stick them back together again and dry them out a bit so they're back into their old shape. And then he'd wet them again and then dry them again. And yeah, this obviously caused quite a lot of angst.
Hmm.
So there are ethical issues with, where you find things, how they were found, the provenance or the chain of custody, how do people get them? And so over time, the countries where these manuscripts are found have generally become more tight in their
Yeah,
restrictions.
yeah,
What you can
I
do.
bet.
Things like the United Nations or international law has got involved. And so they've tightened up the international law around war and international law around kind of the movement of cultural heritage. And people are just generally more sensitive about this sort of thing. So you get all those jokes about the British Museum. Now,
Yep.
I'm these days I'm Australian. I live in the Philippines, but originally I'm from the UK. I actually
Okay.
went to university in London University. In London University, the University College London is actually round the corner from the British Museum. And if you've watched a movie which claims to be the British Museum, quite often you're not actually seeing the British Museum. You're actually seeing my old university because it looks very similar.
Oh,
They're quite
interesting.
similar buildings just around the corner from each other. And if I had a long lunch when I was at university and I was feeling bored, not feeling like doing any work, I might wander over to the British Museum, which was free, and I'd go and have a look at the Rosetta Stone, or I'd go and have a look at the Lachish room and the Cyrus prism and
Oh, cool.
all this kind of stuff you see in Bible dictionaries and on the web. And you could just go and see them. But why are they all at the British Museum? Well, it's because
Right.
the British had an empire
And,
and they just
and they
collect all
took
this
everything.
stuff.
They just
They
took it
took
all.
everything. And there's one section where you got the Elgin marbles. Now, the Elgin marbles are all these amazing marbles, which were originally part of the Parthenon in Athens. And whenever you
Interesting.
used to go into there's a special room for it. You go into there, and the room basically you'd be the one Brit in there, and everybody else in the room would be Greeks, and they'd be all be kind of like, oh, this stuff should be going back to Greece, and there's a
Right, right.
constant conflict. And yeah, the British Museum would be virtually empty if they returned everything to
To its
all the
proper
places.
owners.
But there's a gag. Why aren't the pyramids in the British Museum? Because they're too big.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I mean, it's hilarious and sad all at the same
It
time.
is.
It's
It is.
yeah, yeah.